Love can transpose to form and dignity. Love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind, and therefore is winged Cupid, painted blind. Said Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream, writing stories of romance and reminiscence is then a labor of the mind. Our panelists for the session, Satyajit Sarna graduated from the National Law School, Bangalore in 2008. He lives in New Delhi. He's the author of The Angel's Share. Nighat Gandhi is a writer, mother, Sufi wanderer, and mental health counselor. She spent her formative years in Dhaka and Karachi and have subsequently spent many years in India and the United States. She consciously identifies as a citizen of South Asia to transcend limitations imposed by narrow nationalisms. She's the author of Ghalib at Dusk and Other Stories, and What I Am Today, I Won't Remain Tomorrow, Conversations with Survivors of Abuse. Her memoir and travelogue entitled Alternative Realities, Love and the Lives of Muslim Women has just been published. Nilanjan P. Chowdhury's debut novel, Bali and the Ocean of Milk, was published by HarperCollins in 2012. It's a mythological thriller that features one saucy Apsara, one very paranoid Asura, and several scheming devas caught in a web of murder, myth, and mirth. It was a brief bestseller and received both rave reviews and scathing criticism. His second novel, entitled The Chatterjee Institute of Detection, is going nowhere, but he's trying, so he says. Nilanjan lives in Bangalore with his wife, a daughter, and a home loan. Shobha Narayan writes about food, travel, fashion, art, and culture for many publications, including The Condé Nast Traveller, The National, Financial Times, Destination, Gourmet, Time, Silk Road, and others. She's written for several magazines and journals and currently writes a weekly column for Mint Lounge. Her essay, The God of Small Feasts, published in Gourmet magazine, won the James Beard Foundation's MFK Fisher Award for Distinguished Writing. Her first book, Monsoon Diary, a memoir with recipes, was published by Random House. It was a finalist for a James Beard Award. Her new book, Return to India, was recently published. And moderating the session is Madam Nandita Bose. After a master's in English literature and PhD in aesthetics and 20 plus years in academia and running her own performance management consultancy, Nandita Bose returned to her cherished ideal of writing. The area of interest is romance novels. Her novels are Tread Softly and The Perfume of Promise. The next, Shadow and Soul, is due later this year. Currently, she is also experimenting with poetry and the visual media. I request Madam Nandita Bose to take over the session.
So this is how a literature fest looks from the other side. Beautiful, isn't it? So we decided to make a departure from how the other sessions have been, where, there's a theme and then we all pontificate about the theme. I wanted to just change that a little bit. And I'll tell you the history of why I've decided to change it. I'm basically a very mediocre person. And to make up for my mediocrity, I try to do things thoroughly. So the moment I knew that I had this session to chair, I went to Flipkart, and I bought everybody's books, and I was reading it. And as I kept reading these books, I think that the feeling that most overcame me was this feeling of anger. There were these 4 brilliant writers whom, I could immediately associate with, and nobody from the literature world had tipped me off about them. There's complete silence on the parts of publishers, critics, other writers, readers, about people who are this brilliant. And what I wanted to do with this hour is to showcase the kinds of writing that we have in India and that we don't know about because we are so stupidly just catering to one mass who we believe will be bestsellers. I would like to start with Nighat Gandhi. I find it fascinating that Nighat has three identities of being a Bangladeshi, a Pakistani, and an Indian. The richness of her experience, I think, is qualification enough. But when I started reading her book, I had not read more than two paragraphs before I started crying at the intensity of her experiences in this book that is to be released recently called Alternate Realities. Over to Nighat.
Thanks, Nandita, for that introduction. I'm not much of a LitFest person, so every 3 years or so when a book comes out, I'm asked to attend one of these events, and I come. I'd like to start by reading from the book that's just been published. It's called Alternative Realities, Love in the Lives of Muslim Women. I think I'll talk a little bit about the book later, but basically it's a memoir, it's creative nonfiction, it's a travelogue. It's about my visit to my travels through my three homelands, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And I felt that I couldn't talk about other Muslim women unless I also talked about myself. So I'll read a little bit from the very first chapter. Would that be? Or we agreed to do things differently, so let me just follow that. I traveled to the Northwest Frontier province in Pakistan, which is the Taliban-hit area about 3 years ago. And I had a friend in one of the villages there. We had met in an NGO workshop. And this chapter, Eid in Oogi, is about that visit to her village home. So I'll just read a little bit from there. Thanks, Nandita. So this is while I'm going there. And I have to catch a bus, a van, and then a Suzuki, one of those carries to get to the village. It's a little bit low. At the Mansehra Lari Adda, which is the bus depot, in the dusty disorder of buses and vans, I find a lady's seat in the front row of one of the highest vans leaving for Oogi. Mansehra is named after Man Singh, its 17th century Sikh governor. All the back seats are filled with men returning to their villages for Eid. And this is just before Eid that I went there. So this is during Ramzan, the last few days of Ramzan. My eyes, hungry for the sight of women to make me feel like I belong to this space, scan the bus depot, but except for my lady co-traveler and two burqa-clad women who are hurrying behind their male guardians with hushed, diffident steps in the throng of vehicles outside, I see none. I stare at the row of once white towels hanging outside a hot hammam. What if I'm returning from a grimy trip and need a shower? The hammams are for men only. And then I arrive in the village, and I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs from a shopping trip that we make into the village market with my friends in the village and her cousins. Eid shopping in Oogi. The day after my arrival, that's in the village, Laila, that's my friend, plans a secret shopping trip to Oogi. She says we'll go into town under the pretext of visiting the hospital where she's been training as a lady health worker. The bazaars are crowded just before Eid, and her father wouldn't approve of us going into town. That's because women don't go into town alone. But her mother tells me calmly to wait till her husband leaves. Laila takes off for the hospital with her father early and tells me to come later with her sisters and Zeenat, who also has to wait till her father leaves for work. Laila's aunt from next door also joins the party. Laila's two brothers, aged 14 and 16, accompany us. Women from respectable families don't travel without male companions, even if the accompanying male happens to be the youngest child of the family. And then we find a carry, that's the Suzuki van, to take us into town. Finally, a carry that has room for 3 but can squeeze in 5 stops. We pile in and the two boys hop onto the roof. I'm holding Laila's little sister on my lap, and my knee is 4 inches away from the genitals of the man opposite. I wince at the thought of accidental contact if there's a bump in the road. I shut my eyes and pray. When the man and his women get down, I open my eyes and take my first deep breath. The Pathans are a poetic people, and poetry is everywhere, on the backs of vans and trucks and engraved on gravestones. The Urdu couplet inside the carry reads, Hazaro bar phool khile, hazaro bar bahar aayi, dunya ki wahi ronak, dil ki wahi tanhai. A thousand blossoms bloomed, a thousand springs came. Amid the bustle of the world, the heart's loneliness remained. The metaphor sinks softly into me. 1,000 springs have come and gone, symbolizing hopelessness, poverty, and soul-enriching beauty. When will a spring beyond the 1,000 spring come to announce the end of poverty and war? Will it take 1,000 years for the uncaring and bustling world to open its eye of compassion? 1,000 years of war before peace comes to this land? And I'll stop here, Nandita.
What fascinated me about Nikhat was, of course, that she has 3 nationalities. Apart from that, she's studied at some of the most prestigious institutions of the world and has, held jobs and, done things that we couldn't imagine. And I was wondering, this was the question that what kind of mental travel actually accompanies, your physical travels? And I would like you to answer that question for the audience.
I was traveling for almost 3 years, off and on, for alternative realities. And I think that both happened simultaneously. The travel in the external world, which is always accompanied by the inner travel. So you travel within yourself and to find out who you are. So to answer your question briefly, both happened together, and when the travels for the book stopped, the inner quest, the inner traveling, to travel within yourself, which I think is the real travel, the inner journeys continue, and they continue always.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to our next author now, and I would like to ask Shobha Narayan to read an excerpt. And let me just give you a little background of Shobha's novel as I saw it. So I was like, yes, another NRI writing about India and, that golden tinged India and that golden tinged, US, the land of the greenbacks. And, of course it makes good reading. And, so I'm like, yeah, I'll read it. And I was just fascinated by how intricately she remembers details that we could all relate to. And I think there's magic in her writing, and I think, you can judge, it for yourselves now.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by answering what Nandita alluded to. At its heart, a memoir is a recollection. This one is no different. There are some events from my childhood that I remember vividly. Other incidents are but a feeling. I recall feeling elated, frustrated, or peaceful. From that feeling, and using some details, I have tried to recapture the context. I have changed most names of friends and relatives and have compressed time for the sake of storytelling. I have exaggerated certain characters or dramatized events. What is unchanged, however, is the immigrant dilemma that is at the heart of this book. I hope that this truth will resonate with the reader, even if the individual incidents sound forced or fake. So this book is called Return to India, and in it, the narrative arc of the book is how, as a South Indian middle-class Tamilian girl from a fairly traditional family, I was not allowed to go to the US alone. Everybody said, get married and go. So I talk about how I went, and then I talk about why I returned. So since Nandita basically said, give the readers an idea of the book, that's what I would like to do before her question. And the thing that fascinates me in the writing of this book is the notion of dual identities and how people, all of us who travel within India into a different culture or abroad, we Indians in America in particular, I found, are unable to give up their Indianness. And the question that haunted me was, why live in a new culture if you're not willing to assimilate? Why celebrate Dussehra and Diwali with so much josh, and instead of adopting Thanksgiving or those 4th of July? So why not shed your past identity and belong to your new culture? So the question was, over the course of many years, I started believing that we were leading fairly pseudo lives. And for any transition from, or any exile, there has to be a push from one culture and a pull from another culture. Now, all of us in the audience can relate to this whole notion of going to America to study and giving up, sort of giving up on India. But equally so, I find that for many people of my age who are living in the Silicon Valley or in New York, there is always this, India haunts them. They are unwilling or unable to give it up. And they talk about it constantly. They talk about returning to India. Many of them never do, but they continue to talk about it. And what I find fascinating is, why is this so? Immigrants in the past, America is full of them. They assimilate. Italian Americans they assimilate. A lot of the English Americans, they have given up on India, their old cultures. And the thesis I came up with is that in today's world, we are all economic immigrants, unlike in the past where we were refugees and we had to put the old culture behind us. Economic immigrants are fortunate that we can straddle two cultures. But like Trishanku, the mythological Trishanku, we are unable to hold one as our own. So I talk about all that because I went through it. And my husband was thoroughly happy in America. He was a Wall Street banker. He loves the expanse of America. He loved the fact that you're not constrained in your thinking like in resource-constrained culture. So this book, the drama is about how I want to return and he doesn't, and how I try to convince him, and how the pull of family from India. I have 2 young girls and how they resisted it. So in the end, it's about the drama is the travails we go through to actually return to the motherland. That's the book.
So I'll just ask you a quick question, which I think is there in everybody's mind right now. And that is, did you miss India more when you were there? Or do you miss your US life more now that you're here? Or will you be never satisfied anywhere you are?
Yeah. Very good question. Because I fought so hard to come back, I have a blog, shobhanarayan.com, and I get so much reader accusations based on, you came back for this, but guess what, you're not living the life that you wanted to live. So people try to sort of trip me up. So the short answer to Nandita's question is no. I'm very thrilled and delighted to be in India. I think we live in a sensuous culture and a comedic culture, you know. Like you have guys riding on a scooter with a goat in the middle. You have people riding in an auto rickshaw and 2 hands coming out from either side, and there's a ladder on top. Where do you see all that? I revel in India. I love it. I'm very thrilled to be back.
I think you can also tell your critics to go to hell because you wrote a seminal book on the subject, you know. I think that's the best repartee you can ever give people. This handsome young man on my left is Satyajit Sarna, and I wouldn't like to confess it in public, and therefore I must. I have a secret, a secret vice, and I read college romances like crazy. And so I'm basically India's unauthorized expert on the subject. And when I started reading Satyajit's book, to me it is the last word on a college-based story. But the fact is, you know, if somebody asks me, is it a love story? Yes, it is. Is it a tragedy? Yes, it is. Is it based on a campus in India? Yes, it is. And I was telling him this, that, you know, I need to read his book 5 times more to get all the layers that he has put into it. And I can't believe anybody can at this age. And so I would like to give you the exact feeling that I got on reading his book. And over to you, Satyajit.
That's almost embarrassing, but well, I'm really happy to be here. I spent a lot of time in Bangalore when I was in college, and I really do love this city. And the Angel Share is very, very definitely rooted in Bangalore. And I was just thinking about the theme of this discussion and the reminiscence bit of it. And yesterday, I cut some of the sessions and bunked to town. Just to see if things are, anything like what I remember. And in a sense, I realized afterwards it doesn't matter, because once you put down memories somewhere, once you put them in a concrete form, then they take on a life of their own, and they're no less powerful, they're no weaker, because say there's a giant metro station on MG Road or something. That doesn't change anything that actually matters. So. Anyway, this book, Nandita is right, it is a campus novel. But I actually, when I think of it first in terms of it being an elegy, to someone or something, or it's about lost friends, lost lovers. So what I'd like to do is, I'll take off from the very first page. I'll open right at the opening. And
that's just a ploy to get you to go out and buy his book, but
yeah,
okay.
If I give you the sauce, you won't go for it. Okay, so the first chapter is called Imitation of Life. That's how it goes. After Sasha had died, the task of packing up his belongings was left to me. There wasn't much. I put his books and papers in his big black trunk, and his clothes and sheets in 2 suitcases, and handed them over to his parents. I kept one red shirt aside for Malaika, as I had promised, and swept the room out. Only one thing then remained, a pair of shin guards Sasha had left leaning against the railing to dry. Hard yellow plastic with the brand paint peeling off, the foam on the inside discolored with the sweat, a dead man's shin guards. Those I kept for myself as an inadvertent bequest. Sometimes, even now, I pull them out and look at them. Plastic is a sturdy thing. It does not rot or change. This is the truth we glean from archaeology, that our pots and pans and bangles and shin guards will outlive us all. More than anything, this is the story of Sasha Kapoor and his short and brave life. If there was a way to tell this story fairly, I'd barely show up. I'd skim around the edges like a fruit fly, landing briefly on the scene and then buzzing away. And even if I was witness only to a little of his story, a handful of years, I feel bound to give testimony, because at times I was the sole witness. If anyone else decides that they too should speak, let them come forward and step in the box. Should I go on? Yeah? Okay. One night long ago, Sasha and I were lying on the smoker's slab of the Kaveri hostel terrace. He was wearing only his football shorts, despite the fact that it was getting chilly, which puts us in approximately the autumn of 2002. Our campus on the outskirts of Bangalore was surrounded by miles of eucalyptus forest. From where we lay, it looked like some never-ending velvet carpet over which some careless god had spilt patches of light. Zoju, I saw something in a movie yesterday. What? She said something really interesting. Do you know why people get married? I was feeling unhelpful. Tax reasons, lifetime pass for free sex, kids, whatever else. Yeah, but you can get all of that in other ways. That's why people have sex or get into relationships or have kids. That's not why they get married. And even if those are the reasons why they got married, that's not why they stay married. Sasha used to do this kind of fine semantic hair-splitting exercise all the time. Fine, this is a trick question. You tell me why people who don't even like each other stay married. So, in this movie, Goldie Hawn's character says that it's because everybody needs a witness. Somebody who watches them live their life through. It's just a little creepy. So you get married to some bitch you like, and then you stop liking her. And then she watches you for the rest of your life. See, that's the point. The act of witnessing each other is the actual point of spending your life together. That's the magical part of the sacrament of marriage. Tying two witnesses together. Sounds delightful, I said, and rolled onto my back. But he wasn't listening.
I won't embarrass Satyajit and ask him where he got that wisdom about marriage from. I'll just spare you that. But, I would be very keen to know, how did your inner circle of family and friends react when you told them you're writing a novel?
Well, I mean, some of them didn't see it coming, and then, I would get this call in the middle of the night, like it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I get a call saying, hey, what have you done? You've made me gay. And what do you do with that? I'll kill you, man. But apart from that, I guess people keep trying to look for themselves in things. But
it's nice to know that the character I fell in love with, there's still a chance with. Yeah, great. Nice. I would like to now come to our local Bangalore lad, Nilanjan Chaudhary. Nilanjan's book was possibly the one book that had my jaw drop. We have Indra, who has spent himself in many ways and is now lying in a heap, and he's trying to find ways by which he can regain his strength, shall I say, or potency. Youthful vigor is the right way to say it. I don't want to be crude, so youthful vigor is perfect. And you see the Devs and Asur and their intrigue quite in terms of boardroom drama. And I think it was brilliant that, the mythology was reinterpreted to us, in ways by which we can relate to it. But, before I gas off some more, I think I should turn the mic to him.
Thank you, Nandita, first of all, for calling me a lad. It's a long time since somebody called me a lad. Thank you so much. For those of you who are in the front, you might have noticed that, unlike the other people who are reading from their well-designed books, I'm reading from a printout. And I don't even have the badge. It seems to be the only omission on the part of the organizers of the Bangalore Lit Fest. But let me assure you that my book has been published, so I am not, I'm not cheating you in any way. Yeah, this is the book. I'm told it's available in the Oxford bookshop, piled high, and if there's one book you should buy in this fest, it is this. Thank you. So with that crass self-promotion over, let me talk a little bit about the book. Like Nandita said, it's based on mythology before the whole mythology genre sort of exploded with Amish and the rest of it. And I'm often asked this question, are you a wannabe, are you copying him, etc., etc. I think the tone of the book is very different from the sort of writing that is there in the mythological genre right now. And the influences are really from cinema, and in particular 2 films, Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick and Jaane Bhi Do Yaaro. And really it's an attempt to treat a very serious subject through satire, parody, spoof, and so on. I think it's also a little bit to do with the theme of the discussion today, which is romance. In fact, there's a little too much romance in the original book, which is why there's the printout. I've snipped out the naughty bits, this being a sort of family gathering and so on. So I will read out to you a little bit of the censored version, and Nandita, please feel free to cut me off whenever. It begins with an evening in Amravati. The rays of the setting sun streamed through the tall crystal windows and lit up Urvashi's pretty oval face. Waves of silken hair dyed blonde in deference to the latest fashion cascaded over her pale, shapely shoulders. She was perched upon a blue velvet couch, long bare legs dangling over its edge. As she swung them to and fro, toes brushing against the tiger skin carpet below, her golden anklets tinkled out a melody. She was a sight worthy of the gods, except that the god sitting opposite her did not seem to know this. She mooned at him with her large blue eyes, fluttered her eyelashes, pouted, preened, sighed. Elementary techniques that every Apsara was taught during induction training. But her efforts had little effect on the god for whom they were intended. He continued to sit listlessly on his bed, a glum expression on his puffed face. Urvashi's pout grew deeper. I'm sorry, Indy, but this is just not working. Indra did not reply. Are you even listening to me? Things can't go on like this, It's about time you did something about it. Indra grunted. Urvashi stood up scowling and hurled an ivory comb to the ground. It shattered into pieces as her voice rose to a shrill pitch. Do you realize we haven't made love in over 200 years? Do you? And it's driving me up the wall. Come on, Indy, what's wrong with you? Indra sighed. There was no denying she was right. He was in bad shape. Rolls of fat swaddled his hips. The taut muscles of his arms had turned into flaccid bags. And the chiseled jawline, along which Sachi used to love running her fingers during their courtship days, had disappeared into a pair of pulpy chins. A lock of hair fell over his forehead. He brushed it back, wincing when his fingers touched the bald patch on top. It had surreptitiously replaced his once luxuriant mane and was now clearly visible unless he switched on his halo, the light dazzling anyone who looked at him in the face. But these days, he realized that even the simple act drained him of energy quite quickly. In short, Indra looked and felt like an elderly uncle. Not the almighty king of the Devas, lord of Amravati, scourge of the Asuras, shatterer of citadels. What was wrong was that people had started noticing it. His spies had informed him that the corridors of the palace were abuzz with whisperings of the king's decrepit condition. Many of the lesser gods had even begun to talk openly about it. What was even worse was that the army of healers who had poked and prodded every part of his anatomy could find nothing wrong with him. Your Majesty is perfectly well, they assured him. It's all in the mind. Clean, healthy life for a few days and everything will be fine. And so Indra embarked upon an unpleasant regime of self-improvement. He gave up red meat and took to green vegetables, went for long morning walks, and took cold showers 3 times a day. Every night after Urvashi went to sleep, he would tiptoe over to her dressing table and furtively apply liberal gobs of a pinkish cream called My Fair Lady on his cheeks, hoping that she would not notice its rapidly diminishing levels. But neither creams nor cucumbers seemed to be working, and after a while, even the healers threw up their hands, pleading helplessness. And every morning, the mirror showed him that things were getting worse, and the whispers in the corridor were growing louder and sharper.
I just want feedback from the audience. Now that you've heard all our 4 authors, do you feel you've missed something so far? Have you missed reading these authors? And I have a very short and simple question for Nilanjan now. And the question is, how do you actually keep your wit in check during all those corporate meetings? Or do you sort of, I mean, is your laptop off limits because of the stuff you write in it?
No, I try not to keep myself in check. I think it livens up corporate meetings. That's probably one reason they still keep me in a job as the entertainer.
I'll actually now request Shobha to go into her reading because she answered the question and kind of didn't really read the portion that she intended to.
Although I didn't realize it at that time, New York was seminal in changing my view towards America and India. Cities change people, of course. Where you live influences the kind of person you become. Is it possible to fall madly in love with a city and yet feel the first seeds of discontentment about your life? Perhaps because of its amplified presence in the American and Indian psyche, New York raised questions like this in my mind. Our life was idyllic in many ways, and yet, in retrospect, lonely as well. Stuck with a toddler in an apartment, the land of the free didn't feel so free to me. It was in New York that I first began confronting what I call the India question. At parties and gatherings, I would gravitate towards people who were like me, Indians with young children who were conflicted about their life in America, and yet who could not give up on India. I began hearing about people who were seriously considering moving back to India for good. Those were just whispers. What turned it into a scream was a group that we formed called Sarigama. It began initially as a way for good friends to meet once in a while, and in the typical Indian fashion of forcing down Indian culture down the children's throats, we taught our children bhajans. We were 6 families with kids, and it was torture for them. We began meeting once a month on a Sunday with a potluck lunch, vegetarian of course, and a dose of strong Indian culture. Invariably, we would all get homesick after lunch, and the topic, wherever it began, would wind its way to the now dreaded India question. We would start with how fresh the vegetables tasted back home and quickly move to how many of us needed to save how much money to return to India. Should I read more? Okay. Then there's another section where I talk about dressing up for an Indian party in India. Dressing up for an Indian party in New York was, for me, a complicated exercise fraught with rules and miscues. Dressing up for a party at Zahid made it doubly so. On the one hand, I did not want to seem too Indian, oh God, dressed like my mother in a traditional sari and dime-sized bindi. On the other hand, I didn't want to show up in a cocktail dress or pantsuit and confront a sea of women decked out in ethnic finery. Not only would I stand out, worse, I would be instantly labeled as a pseudo-Indian who tried to be too Americanized. Indians in America have a highly honed instinct for spotting artifice, probably because many of us have attempted it ourselves. After all, what's the point of starting afresh in a new land if you cannot reinvent yourself into somebody else, be it a suave corporate chieftain, a Nobel Prize winning professor, media darling, policy wonk, or a UN high flyer who cloaks ambition with charm? These are all, Shashi Tharoor was in New York at that time, Amartya Sen had just, so these are very specific references. Yet, within each of us lay contradictions. We touted American enterprise, yet engaged in acts that were the antitheses of free will. Conducting an arranged marriage before 1,000 guests in one's native village was one. Consulting an astrologer or shaving your child's hair on a preordained auspicious day was another. We were all of us rational professionals with some irrational Indian predilections, such as our love for cricket, curry, and cold water without ice, a craving for mango pickle and mother's rasam, and a belief in the curative powers of Vicks Vapor Rub, Fair & Lovely, face cream, and Woodward's gripe water.
Keep going until it's done, and then you can put your, you can put your pen down, you can shut your laptop and think, well, that's done. So it's kind of emotional to deal with things that are tough.
Thank you. You, Shobha?
So the process I also followed was this. I wish I had a more dramatic life, because writing a non-fiction memoir limits you, because I wish I were born in a circus. I wish I were, or my parents were dysfunctional, or I had a long-lost brother that I sort of lost at childhood. But given the constraints of normal life, what you do is you write stream of consciousness into the computer, and then you distill and cull and choose only the dramatic parts. Ruth Reichel, who wrote these wonderful food memoirs, had a nice statement that helped me a lot. She said, everything in this book is true, but it's not particularly perfectly accurate. So I took licenses using that. So the truth was there, but like I said, you condense, you exaggerate, you maximize, and you shrink when needed.
And you wrote a fantastic book. For all of us who had similar, of course I've never been, never decided to ever leave the shores and live abroad. But, the authenticity of your experiences through my own and others were just spot on and so entertaining. The same question to you, Nikat.
When I started working on alternative realities, I thought, should I talk about my own life? And then somehow the decision was made for me. I just started writing the first chapter, and it was about me. It was incredibly painful. I wrote, I think, the first couple of pages and then just couldn't go on for months after that. But in the end, I'm glad I wrote it, because I think, painful as it was also incredibly therapeutic. And I think I write because it's therapy. It just brings out the pain, but it also helps you transcend it and move beyond it. The first chapter it's called The Works, and it's about an encounter with my father, where he The Works was the name of a pizza that we ordered in the US, and it had all kinds of forbidden meat on it. For Muslims, there was pork on it, and my father discovers that I've ordered this pizza, and it's haram, right? You're Muslim. So if you would like, I could just like to read a passage from that chapter, because that's what it was. Writing this chapter was incredibly hard. And like Shobha said, so it's not true word for word, but this is sort of generally what happened. And that's the creative edge that you get when you write a memoir. You can almost fictionalize it, even though the incident is pretty much what happened. So this is June 1999, USA. Abba came to the table later than all of us. We were into our second and third slices of pizza by then. Juju removed a slice of the mushroom and onion pizza for him. Didn't you order anything with meat? He asked. What's in that box? He pointed at the other carton. Oh, that's all mixed things, said Juju. I could sense the edginess in her voice. Mixed? What do you mean, mixed? He pulled the carton towards himself, lifted the flap, and stared at the glistening pink discs of pepperoni and chunks of sausage. What's all this? It's all mixed, Juju said in a begging voice. Mixed? You mean pork? You mean pig meat? He snarled. We stared at our plates as if we needed some words of deliverance to rent the stillness in the room. Is it pork? Abba repeated in a voice that used to make my stomach heave as a child. Nobody answered. Who ordered it? Nobody looked up from their plates. How could you bring this haram thing into my house? He thundered. Who ordered it? None of us said a word. None of us could. None of us had the courage to meet his eye. We stopped eating. Prayers of deliverance were still beating in our hearts, but hopes were abandoned. The silence in the room expanded like an evil spirit. I wished for the world as we had known it to end. I prayed for some calamity, a crashing noise, a child's cry, an earthquake, anything, but nothing broke the intolerable silence. I ordered it, I found myself saying. Blood rushing to my twisted guts, some deep barrier giving way. Finally, something was conquering the silence. I had waded through a thick, gravy-like dread to break it. How could you do such a thing, my father said, going redder and becoming once more the man whose fury I feared most. My childhood had never really ended. So this is just what it meant for me to write this chapter, and this was just the beginning of it. It was painful.
So speaking of reminiscence, this book is very deeply rooted in my childhood. I was very lucky to have grown up in the very beautiful hill station of Shillong. And also very lucky, I think, to be the last generation which didn't have, daytime television, and in fact, television of a kind. Of course, my kid would say that I was very unlucky, but because we didn't have TV or anything else, it was basically, playing and reading books and listening to stories. And my memories of my grandmother reading out the Mahabharata and the Ramayana in the original Bengali couplet form stayed very deeply with me for many, many years. And they were also illustrated. There was a picture of Parikshit being killed by a giant snake, which actually enters into his palace, which is heavily guarded against a snake attack, in the form of a worm, and it then comes out of the apple and it suddenly engulfs him completely. So that picture, I can still see it today as if it were yesterday. And very curiously, the snake plays a major role in the book itself. So.
I recall that passage. So time flies when you're having a good time, and I'm so sorry, but our time is coming to an end. But before we end, I want to do two short things. I would open the floor for audience questions. Keep it short and direct it to one of the members of the panel. And then I would want the members of the panel to just read out a short 1-minute thing, so that, a 1-minute bit, so that they leave you with the flavor of today.
Sir, I'll just come.
Hi, everybody. My name is Samantak. The question I had was basically targeted right in the beginning, and this is something that popped up in my mind right in the beginning when I heard Nikhat's, that particular excerpt, and then Nilanjan's excerpt. The big difference in the two excerpts was basically the degree of humor. So hers was a bit more somber with generous dollops of humor in it, whereas Nilanjan's was primarily playing on the humor part. That's where we got so much of energy out of it. So can you just, and I'll open it up for the whole panel, I mean, how important is the relation between humor and romance? Because when you say romance, it doesn't really, inspire a lot of happy or funny undertones. So how do you blend both of these mutually exclusive elements, humor and romance, and how are they important to each other? Probably.
For me, humor is very important, but I don't intentionally bring it into my writing. It just, life is humorous, there are just so many contradictions. So it just, when you're writing, it will come into your writing. It does in mine, and I think, I hope it's humorous when you read it. And about romance, alternative realities is about love, the different dimensions of love in the lives of Muslim women that I met during my travels. So for me, it was seamless. I wasn't saying, okay, now it's romance, I've got to bring in this much humor or whatever. It just happens at an unconscious level.
For me, humor is extremely important. And I've tried to sort of consciously work it into the story. I didn't consciously think of the romance angle. Of course, there is the heart of the story is really around romance. It's to do with Indra, as they say, trying to regain his youthful vigor for the love of his Apsara. But I think that the humor there is really in terms of a slightly darker, edgy sort of thing. Romance means different things to different people, and especially for a man who is in power, it can be one of those things. Whereas for somebody else, it could be the sort of crux of life. So here, Indra does what he does because he feels weakened as a man, and that's and the humor sort of comes at the sort of things that a guy will do to get the girl is quite amazing, including, blow up the world, which is one of the things apparently that, is attributed as one of the reasons why Hitler was what he was. So I sort of took it up from there.
My question, it's not a question, it's kind of an information I want from Satyajit. I being a screenwriter, I write screenplays and dialogues. I went back to the days of Dil Chahta Hai while you were reading your plot. In that, you have written it in the first person. While writing, so all your friends have been included. I don't know whoever is included. But did you have some experience kind of a thing that you have portrayed somebody like it is misunderstood or misinterpreted by somebody after reading? Because you have good friendship with certain person, and then when you put it in a book, he reads something between the lines, and then he starts fighting with you.
Well, I hope not, and nothing's really come up because of that. I do think, however, that and this I keep having to explain is however close to your source you hew, fiction does not follow the rules of life. For example, if you have tension with someone else, you have a fight with someone you're in a relationship with or something that goes on for days, there's this, and it's so subtle and it goes and dips and stuff, you can't show it as it is. So to write fiction, you necessarily have to bend and beat life out of shape. So I think it's not really fair for anyone who feels that they may have been portrayed to ever really take very, very severe offense, that you can't show life as it is. No person can really be held accountable for any actions that a fictive avatar would have taken because, they bear no relation. It's tenuous. It's linked very loosely.
We'll take one last question.
Lots of people took offense with my book, by the way. So that rule doesn't apply with nonfiction. And you have to be prepared for that.
Isn't writing, like all form of art, a self-indulgent activity? Because I'm a closet writer, I believe it is so. But only for a historian, possibly.
Can I answer that?
Yes.
Okay. So, I've been attending as many sessions as possible, and there were people who were saying, हिंदी में लिखें, भाषा में लिखें, अंग्रेजी, अरे लिखो तो सही, पढ़ो तो सही. Everything else comes later. The space in our public life and our private life that is being given to arts, to creativity, to literature is constantly shrinking. And it has to be people like us who push back the boundaries and fight for what we believe in. I'm sorry we will have to end the session now because we would be eating into somebody else's time. But I would just want to leave you with this little bit of advice. If it is right for somebody who has no money to give investment advice, please invest in these 4 books that we have been speaking about. It might be the best investment you give yourself the whole year. Thank you. Yeah, and we'll be available at the author signing tent for your, if in case you want your copies autographed. Thank you so much.